Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And feel free to email us with any questions or concerns with the email address at the bottom of the screen. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at the watches and warnings that we do have out for the state. All of them are located along the west coast of the state for today. And we do have all the ones in red here, anywhere from St. Lawrence Island area up towards actually the Point Lay area are all blizzard warnings along the coastline. So we have St. Lawrence Island and Bering Strait locations. That warning is valid until 6 a.m. on Sunday. So move a little bit further north to the Chukchi Sea coastline. That one is going to start a little bit from now, 6 p.m. this evening, and go until around Sunday at 6 p.m. And then as we get further north up along the coast from Point Lay west, that warning is going to start from 9 p.m. this evening until 3 p.m. on Sunday. We also have our watches here around the Norton Sound area and up through the Seward Peninsula, up by the Kotzebue Sound area as well. Those are all for snow and blowing snow, especially around the Norton Sound area. As we get closer to the Kotzebue Sound area, that is primarily the blowing snow. So for the ones furthest to the south, those are going to be in effect from Saturday afternoon until late Sunday night. As we move further to the north towards the Seward Peninsula, those are going to be in effect from Saturday evening until late Sunday night. Then as we get into the Kotzebue Sound area, Saturday evening through Sunday afternoon. For any more information, please check our website for further details. So look at our weather coming in from our satellite imagery here. We do have our frontal system pushing through, starting to make it into the central Bering locations, bringing in some warmer air up with that. But as we get further to the north, expecting to see snow with that, with the main low pressure center here further out to the west of those western Aleutian Islands. Looking out over mainland Alaska, we can see the effects of ridging building in over much of the state here, clearing out some of that cloud cover, especially around the Bristol Bay area. And then finally, we'll watch one more low push east across the Gulf of Alaska, bringing a lot of precip to areas of the Gulf, but not quite making it to the Panhandle at this time. It may skirt to the south and miss them entirely. So as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we do have that low in the southern part of the Gulf there, warm enough to be rain, but not quite making it to the Panhandle or areas along the North Gulf Coast, having pushed off now for much of Kodiak Island. High pressure dominating much of this day, which does give us some fog along the Arctic coastline, some lighter areas of snow in the northeastern part of the Arctic coast as well. And we have our high pressure extending down into the Bristol Bay area, clearing out a lot of the precip there, but we have our system moving in through the Bering Sea with the snow out ahead of that and some stronger winds up there, bringing those blowing snow conditions to St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coastline. And then as we move up further to the north, going to see some of that snow pushing in very soon there as well, with some blowing snow conditions expected. Behind this cold front, we do have some colder air, of course, and we are seeing some snow showers with that out by the western Aleutian Islands. For tonight, that low is going to start to break down with that frontal system, but we are still going to see the stronger winds along the coastline and some remnants of snow still blowing around a lot of that snow throughout much of tonight for areas anywhere from the Yukon Delta area up the coastline all the way towards that Point Lay area. And again, we don't necessarily need new snow. With a lot of the snow that has fallen, we can still see blowing snow conditions there just because the stronger wind being able to blow around the snow that is already on the ground. We do have another low pressure system moving up from the south, headed towards the eastern Aleutian Islands, bringing some snow and eventually some rain to the islands there. Further west, we have some areas of snow, and underneath our high pressure, we do expect some fog in the Cook Inlet area up along the Arctic coastline, and still being pretty clear to the south in the Panhandle, with that system skirting off to the south and east. For Saturday, high pressure continuing to dominate much of mainland Alaska, including the Panhandle. For south central interior, not expecting any new precipitation here on Saturday. As we get up further to the north, some isolated areas of snow shower, but along the west coast, even though a lot of the new snow is stopping falling, we are going to see some areas of blowing snow up along that coastline with the stronger winds that we have there and the new snow that we have had fall. Our other system that was further to the south is now pushed into the central Bering Sea, bringing warm air to the Alaska Peninsula, bringing some rain to those locations, transitioning to snow as we get further to the north, and out west expecting that to be snow as well. Then on Sunday, even another new system coming in from the south, bringing more warm air and rain to all the Aleutian Islands. As we get closer towards the Pribilof, still a little bit colder there, expecting to see snow. And an old frontal boundary here breaking down, we have a lot of snow up along the west coast, anywhere from around the Barrow area down through much of western part of the state, down around the south central as well, with a low pressure system that is formed off of an old triple point by Kodiak Island. Along the west coast by St. Lawrence Island, still seeing some blowing snow conditions, as well as up by Barrow. Then over the Panhandle area, high pressure keeping out much of the precipitation. For Saturday morning, our low temperatures expected starting down in the Panhandle area, primarily the upper teens to mid-20s. Some locations further to the south, a little bit warmer, 29 expected for Ketchikan. So moving to the south central, single digits for most of the landlocked areas, but as we get closer towards the water, expecting to see lows in the teens, except for Glenallen, a little bit colder there, -15. In the interior, eastern locations being the coldest, dropping down well below zero, but as we get further to the west, most of the temperatures staying in the single digits or even into the teens as we get closer towards Galena. Arctic Village being the coldest, down to -22 and below zero along much of the Arctic coastline. Out west, with those systems coming up from the south, we are seeing a lot of warmer air up there, with temperatures dropping down to the mid-teens to mid-20s along the coastline. That's going to extend all the way down to the Bristol Bay area. We are seeing temperatures drop to just above freezing for the Alaska Peninsula, and that's going to be true also for the Aleutian Islands and the Pribilof Islands, with St. Paul dropping down to 35 for a low Saturday morning. Moving into Saturday afternoon, high temperatures expected to get into the upper 30s for much of the Aleutian Islands. Warmer as we get to the Unalaska area, 42 there, right around 40 degrees for the Alaska Peninsula. Above freezing for much of the Bristol Bay area. However, Dillingham staying a little bit colder. They're only getting up to 29 degrees on Saturday afternoon. Up around freezing for much of the west coast with that strong push of warm air from the south. As we get along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see temps drop off as we move further to the east, only getting up into the single digits for the eastern parts of the Arctic coastline. Down into the interior, we are seeing an influx of warmer air there. Western portions of the interior getting up around 20 degrees. But as we get further to the east, getting just above the single digits there, with Fort Yukon staying only around 0 degrees. In the south central, getting up into the mid-20s, along the coastline, mid-30s. Kodiak getting up to 40 degrees. And right around freezing for much of the Panhandle, warmer again further to the south. Lows for Sunday morning dropping down into the teens for much of the Panhandle area and south central Alaska. Some areas a little bit more interior are going to get into those single digits, like Talkeetna at 8 degrees, or all the way down to -17 for Glenallen area. In the interior, single digits for the most part. Further to the east and north, going to get below 0 there. Up along the Arctic coastline, single digits for the most part until we get further to the west, where temperatures are going to stay in the teens, and then in the 20s all along the west coast of the state. Mid-30s for the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Islands. And as we move into Sunday afternoon, highs getting up around 40 degrees for the Aleutian Islands, 36 for St. Paul. Just above freezing for much of the west coast up through the Norton Sound from the Bristol Bay area. Into the teens for the Arctic coastline. Much of the interior in the teens or right around 20 degrees. And in south central Alaska, mid-20s to mid-30s as we get closer towards the coast, and upper 20s to low 30s for the Alaska Panhandle. Back quickly with the aviation.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For our aviation section, we'll start off with a quick look at our flight weather. Off in the Bering Sea, we do have a frontal system pushing through the central Bering Sea, and we will actually watch that track through the next couple days as it moves over mainland Alaska. But for now, it's just bringing some MVFR and IFR conditions to the central Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with some MVFR conditions further west out by the western Aleutians. Over the west part of the state, MVFR conditions dominate, and that's also going to extend into areas of the interior as well. And then up along the Arctic coastline, some more areas of VFR. Much of south central Alaska and the Panhandle should be VFR. As we look into Saturday afternoon, a lot of that cloud cover is going to diminish over the interior, resulting in more VFR conditions, but there are still some isolated areas of MVFR and IFR. Along the Arctic coastline, more MVFR conditions, and our frontal system now pushing into the eastern part of the Bering Sea, bringing MVFR and IFR conditions there into the Alaska Peninsula as well. Now we'll have on Sunday morning that frontal system over the west coast bringing MVFI and IFR conditions to those locations. MVFR conditions moving into the western part of the Aleutian Islands and out over the interior part of the state, expecting some MVFR conditions there as well for Sunday morning, and up along the Arctic coastline, MVFR and IFR conditions, especially as we get further to the east. Then as we move into Sunday afternoon, much of the eastern part of the state clears out to VFR conditions, but along the west coast with our frontal system now stalling over the west coast, we are going to see some MVFR and IFR conditions there. Then we have a new system moving in out over the western Aleutian Islands, bringing MVFR and IFR conditions throughout much of the central and western Aleutian Islands, starting to make its way towards the Pribilof Islands as well. For our flight level, or for our passes rather, we have AKwx Pass going to start off VFR, drop down to marginal conditions. That will be true for Adigan Pass as well. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be VFR for Saturday, as well as Rainy Pass, Windy Pass, and Isabel should all be VFR for Saturday. Mentasta Pass also going to be VFR. Tanita Pass, VFR expected for Saturday, as well as Portage. And Chilkoot and White should both be VFR throughout the day on Saturday. Taking a look now at our surface freezing levels, we do have our surface line going out over the Panhandle and up towards or along the North Gulf Coast, then out over the eastern part of the Bering Sea. And then we have our upper level freezing levels starting from the 2,000 feet there, pushing warmer air as that frontal system comes up, brings a lot of warm air with it, extending that warm air all the way up towards the Seward Peninsula area throughout the Alaska Peninsula as well. Taking a look now at our icing, as expected with the big frontal system moving in, we have a lot of icing out over the Bering and Aleutian Islands, between 2,000 and 5,000 feet over the islands, and dropping down a little bit as we get further to the north towards St. Lawrence Island and Nunavik Island. Then an area out over in the northern part of the state below 3,000 feet expected there. For our jet stream, strongest part of the jet coming in at 155 knots out of a westerly direction. So we move over the Aleutians into the Bering Sea about 120 knots out of a southerly direction there. Curving back around and headed out of a northerly direction over the eastern part of the state, getting up to as high as 120 knots. Drop down to 9,000 feet, we have westerly flow out over the western Aleutian Islands, 20 to 25 knots there, getting stronger as we get closer towards this low, about 40 knots there. We have southerly flow out over the central and eastern parts of the Bering Sea as high as 65 to 70 knots in this corridor, moving from the Alaska Peninsula up towards St. Lawrence Island, but dropping down pretty quick as we get into this ridging. And then northwesterly flow over mainland Alaska, 20 to 40 knots, strongest over the northwestern part of the state, and down to around 30 knots as we get over the eastern part of the state, but up to as high as 50 knots as we start moving over the Alaska Panhandle. As we drop down to 3,000 feet, we have that same north to northwest flow out over the eastern part of the state, including the Alaska Panhandle, and we do have around 35 knots there, picking up to 50 knots as we move out over the Gulf. Flow over much of the mainland part of the state is more of a westerly flow pattern, moving around our high pressure and ridging out over the state, 15 to 20 knots there. But we have our strongest corridor of winds once again right over that eastern part of the Bering Sea through the Alaska Peninsula as well, up to as high as 70 knots there, just north of the Alaska Peninsula, dropping down to around 60 knots as we get closer towards St. Lawrence Island, and then curving up to around 45 knots as we move through the Bering Strait area. Out over the rest of the Bering Sea, primarily a southerly flow, 15 to 25 knots. However, as we get south of the Aleutian Islands, a little bit stronger there, 40 knots expected. So for our turbulence, we saw those stronger winds, so we can't expect a lot of turbulence from the eastern Aleutian Islands into the Bristol Bay area, including Kodiak Island, and up along much of the west coast, all the way up towards that Point Hope area, and this does include St. Lawrence Island as well. We also have some areas of moderate turbulence over the Copper River Basin area and down through much of the Panhandle. We will be back shortly with the marine forecast.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and today I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Uccellini, the Director of the United States National Weather Service. Welcome back to Alaska, sir.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Prior to being the leader of the National Weather Service, your work included an extensive look at snowstorms across the northeastern United States. These are the types of storms that can bring some of the country's largest cities to its knees. Tell me a little bit about your fascination with snow.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in weather, growing up as a kid on Long Island, New York, and was particularly fascinated by snowstorms, why they occurred. The distribution of snow was very varied across the entire region. The rain-snow line all those things fascinated me right from the get-go. And I was interested in knowing how they worked, how the forecast worked, or more often than not, didn't work one way or the other. And that drove me, that interest continued to build and drove me through high school right into college, wanting to be a meteorologist.
Okay, that's a fascinating story, and I think every meteorologist has a weather story like that in some way.
Right.
Due to Alaska's size and proximity to the North Pole, sometimes it's difficult to detect and analyze the weather patterns over Alaska. What's the National Weather Service doing to improve that weather detection?
Well, observations in this type of environment is a big challenge, whether it's from space or from what we call in situ observations from the ground or within the systems. Clearly, satellites have been playing an increasing role in providing the big picture, not only from a visual sense in what you see is occurring, but also from providing the data for numerical models that then are used to actually predict the weather. Alaska is actually pretty well positioned with respect to polar orbiting satellites, since you get a faster return of those satellites over your particular area. And in fact, the polar satellite system is the backbone for the observations that we use in our models, especially our global models, and they're particularly important for observing weather features that affect Alaska.
Alaskans live and die by the weather every day, and one of the strategic goals of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service is to develop a more weather-ready nation. What does it mean for Alaskans to be weather-ready?
Well, the strategic outcome is based on people being ready, responsive, and therefore resilient to the increasing threats to extreme weather events. Those threats are related to not only the nature of the events, but the fact that we're becoming more vulnerable to them as we have more people, more infrastructure that could be affected by these events. So we have to ensure that the observations we make for situational awareness, the forecasts we make for people to take the proper responses, are connected to people's actions, the response to these events, so that they will be more resilient to what's facing them. There are examples with respect to hurricanes. More people living along the coastline takes longer to evacuate. We have to make better forecasts with longer lead times, but we also have to communicate the threat so people will actually take action to avoid those storms. Up here you have, as in other parts of the United States, an increasing threat related to fire. As there are more people living in fire-prone areas, we have to ensure that our forecasts are good, that we don't have false alarms that make people not react to the forecast when in fact they should. But we also have to be able to communicate the threat and make sure that we're working with the partners in the emergency management community so that communities and right down to individuals will actually take the proper responses in the face of these events. So that's the strategic goal. There are a lot of challenges for us in terms of improving forecasts, but also improving our communication skills and linking with the emergency management communities that are actually out there trying to protect lives and mitigate property loss.
So a huge partnership effort going forward.
That's one of the important keys for the success of meeting the strategic goal.
Okay. Well, one of the things you're talking about was understanding the weather information we're getting back from the computers, weather modeling, and you did a lot of work with that in some of your prior positions with the Environmental Prediction Center there, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. What can you tell us about recent improvements in that weather modeling? And you were using the polar orbiters as kind of a source of information that started that process.
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that everything you see, you read and hear about weather, climate, or ocean forecasts are all driven by numerical models. Now, it really has been the revolution in our forecast process in the last part of the 20th century. The success of that numerical enterprise is based on three factors: big computers, global data, not just local data, but you have to have a global data set, and then the models themselves, the science that's behind the models and in running the models in an operational mode. So we're working to improve all three of those components. We upgraded our computers last year. We're going through another upgrade even as I speak. We'll be upgrading from 200 trillion calculations per second to 700 trillion calculations per second by January of 2015. This increase in the computer will allow us to run what we call Earth system models. It's not just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, ocean, ice, which is obviously very important up here, and land models that are all coupled together at higher resolution. So you need the big computers, you need the science that allows us to run these models and run them in a parallel mode, and that they're coupled so that the ocean effects could affect the atmosphere and vice versa, as an example. And then the global observations are absolutely critical, and over the last 20, 30 years they've become more dependent upon the satellite systems, and especially the polar orbiting satellites, which help drive the observations needed for those models, whether they be atmospheric observations, land, ice observations. We're deriving more and more of that from satellites now that feed into these models and produce forecasts with extended lead times. Now out, for extreme events especially, we're seeing much improved forecast out in the 4, 5, 6, 7, and even 8-day range, which gets us back to Weather Ready Nation, because if you're going to get ready for a storm event, you want those consistent forecasts approaching that event from day 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, so you can take the actions several days in advance that can help mitigate the property loss and protect your livelihood.
Okay, all part of the mission of protecting life and property. Dr. Uccellini, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and speaking to Alaskans and sharing how the National Weather Service is working for Alaska and the nation. Wish you safe travels around the 49th. Enjoy your time here, sir. And for Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at the ice edge. If we noticed from yesterday, there has been a lot more warm air coming up, so a lot more of open waters in the ice, especially in that southern part of Norton Sound area. And with that continued southerly flow and warm air moving up, we are expecting the ice conditions to push back and retreat more to the north for the next several days. Taking a look now at the remainder of our marine forecast, starting in the southeast, we have primarily northerly flow, 25 to 35 knots for most parts in the eastern part of the Gulf and the inside waters. However, as we get further to the north, much stronger winds, northerly direction, around 50 knots up there. Seas anywhere from 9 to 11 feet in the Gulf, and then 5 to 10 feet getting higher as we get further to the north in the inside waters. Then on Sunday, continuing to see a lot of northerly flow, winds dropping down to 40 knots, but still pretty strong there. Then down to 25 knots as we get further to the south, out in the Gulf, southern locations starting off with that northerly flow, 25 knots there, and becoming lighter and out of a southeasterly direction as we get further to the north. For south central Alaska, seeing a lot of northerly flow in this area as well, 15 to 20 knots in the northern Gulf and Prince William Sound area. As we look out over the Barrens area, a little bit stronger there out of a somewhat northerly direction, around 25 knots in southern Cook Inlet as well, and the northern Cook Inlet out of the north at 10 knots. As we move into Sunday, we are going to see flow switching up, becoming southeast to easterly around the Barren Islands, 20 to 25 knots. Northerly flow in Cook Inlet, still 10 to 15 knots there. And then we have variable flow around 10 knots for much of the Prince William Sound area, northern part of the Gulf. Into Saturday for the Alaska Peninsula, southeasterly flow around the peninsula, strongest to the west, 40 to 45 knots there, dropping down to 30 knots as we get further to the east, and then around Kodiak Island, flow around 15 knots there. For Sunday, flow becoming much more southwesterly. We do have 20 to 25 knots in western locations, getting up to as high as 35 knots south of Port Hayden. As we get closer towards Kodiak Island, southeasterly flow 30 knots, seas around 12 feet, and then Shelikof Strait easterly flow around 25 knots there. For the Aleutian Islands, we have westerly flow becoming southerly as we get to the Bering side of the islands, 15 to 20 knots until we get by the eastern Aleutian Islands, stronger there, southeast 40 to 45 knots with gusts as high as 55 knots on the Bering side. For the western Aleutian Islands, westerly flow 20 to 30 knots there, sea 17 to 18 feet. Then on Sunday, flow becoming a little bit stronger and out of a southeast to east direction, 35 to 40 knots there, sea 16 to 19 feet. Southerly flows will get further off to the east, 40 to 45 knots for the most part, diminishing as we get further off to the east. Saturday along the west coast of the state, southeasterly flow 35 to 40 knots until we get up by the Norton Sound area, where winds are going to drop down to around 25 knots. By the Pribilof Islands, St. Matthew Island, southeasterly flow 35 to 40 knots there. Then on Sunday, flow diminishing and becoming more southwesterly, 20 to 30 knots, strongest as we get by St. Paul and St. George areas. As we get up by the St. Lawrence Island area, southwesterly flow 35 knots there. Along the Arctic coastline, starting on the west coast, we have southerly flow 30 to 35 knots, but as we get along the Arctic coastline, dropping down to 10 to 20 knots. Then on Sunday along the Arctic coastline, starting off again on the west coast, we have flow out of a somewhat southerly direction, 35 knots, diminishing as we get closer towards Barrow, down to 25 knots there. Then easterly flow 10 to 15 knots as we get over in the Beaufort Sea area. Quick recap for the state for the remainder of these next couple days here. Starting with tonight, we have a low coming up from the south, bringing warmer air towards the eastern Aleutian Islands, transitioning the snow over to rain. Further to the west, a little bit colder, going to continue to see the snow. But overnight along the west coast of the state, we do have some stronger winds and some snow falling there. So anywhere from St. Lawrence Island to the Bering Strait coast, along the Chukchi Sea coast and up towards Point Lay, we do have blizzard warnings out for much of tonight. For additional details, please check our website. Those conditions are going to last into Saturday. And then we do have high pressure dominating much of mainland Alaska, south central, and even parts of the Panhandle, keeping void of much precipitation. But as expected underneath the fog, Cook Inlet's going to see some fog, and we are going to see some fog along the Arctic coastline. Then into Saturday, high pressure continuing to dominate the Panhandle, south central, interior parts of the state. Going to still see some of those blowing snow conditions along the northern parts of the west coast, including Seward Peninsula, YK Delta coastline there, and up by the Point Lay area. Low pressure system moving into the central Bering Sea, a lot of warm air bringing some rain up towards the Alaska Peninsula, but out west staying cold. You're going to see more snow showers for the western Aleutian Islands. With Alaska weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.